Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, brought to you by City Current and powered by Lipscomb & Pitts Insurance. This show shares personal stories and insight from those who are giving back and making a difference, so we can learn and do the same. We cover life lessons, business advice, passion, and purpose. Now here's our host, Jeremy Park.
Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. This time, our focus is on aging, and we have a national organization that's focused heavily on aging and building inclusive communities all over the USA. We're here with the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO of ChangeMakers and Aging, Dr. John Feather. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Absolutely. So welcome to Memphis. You're here to speak locally here in the next couple of days, but you're also coming back in October for a big conference that you guys are hosting here in Memphis. So we're thankful and honored to have you here. And let's start with part of the ChangeMakers is that we get to talk a lot about the work you're doing, obviously, professionally, but we also get to share a little bit your story personally. Mm-hmm. So before we dive into the work you're doing professionally, tell us a little about just where you grew up.
So I grew up in Houston, Texas, in a part of town that was a nice part of town then. It is nicer now. It's been gentrified. But went to public high schools and colleges, was the first person in my extended family on both sides to have attended college. So that was a big part of it. But grew up in, I think for our Memphis friends, the notion that I grew up at a time when I never went to an air-conditioned school, and I never lived in an air-conditioned house, which people these days do not believe is even possible.
Well, especially growing up in Houston. It is humid in Houston.
It's
and hot. I can say that because I'm from Texas.
It's incredibly hot and humid. So especially, I'm not sure how we ever learned anything in school, but we did.
So brothers, sisters, what was family life like?
I have one brother who is a Catholic priest who serves in, as he puts it, he has 2 small rural parishes in central Texas and 2 prisons. And he always enjoys the prison work because, as he says, at least they know they have some improvement to do, unlike some of his parishioners.
So share maybe when you look at traditions, things that you remember, especially growing up there in Houston or just in general. What are some things that stick out to you as just neat traditions, neat experiences, vacations? What are some things that stand out to you?
Let's see. Certainly, like most Southerners, memories of food. And my grandmother, who lived on a farm all of her life, had wonderful fried chicken. Of course, I learned later the secret to the way Grandma made fried chicken was you had to have the bucket of bacon fat sitting on the stove at all times, and you would dip into the bucket of bacon fat, fill it up 3 inches in the skillet, and then cook it. Which is something that no one would dare to do these days. So certainly those memories, but certainly, in a hot climate like that, being outside all the time.
Right.
Because it was just too hot to be in the house.
So did you grow up playing sports, or, you've got obviously the Houston Astros, Houston Oilers probably then versus the Texans now. Right. Sports, was that big?
It was. My brother was a very good football player. I was always in the band and did the musical side of things. So we had the 2 of those things. But yeah, no. And so to this day, I can't abide people who talk about Dallas as America's team. Like, no, we're in Texas together. You're the Dallas team. We're the Houston team.
So did you follow when the Oilers became the Titans? Did you follow the Titans, or did you stay loyal and say, okay, we're waiting for the Texans to get here?
Forget that. But, we got to see the Astros finally win the World Series.
Right.
So,
Big deal. So what band instrument did you play?
French horn.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you still play?
No, it's a hard one to do by yourself. I've been in choral music pretty much all my life since then.
So so after college, kind of describe you getting into, when you talk about ChangeMakers and Aging, obviously this wasn't your first job out of college, so kind of describe getting into this work that you do with seniors.
So it was, like for many people, a serendipitous thing. I actually got a PhD in organizational sociology, the study of organizations, and have not really done that professionally ever since. I got a job at the State University of New York in Buffalo, New York, and I ended up working for a guy who started the Geriatrics division there at the medical school and also in the VA hospital. And that was in the early days of aging work in the United States in the early 80s. And so we started working on projects together, and basically over time he just said, I think you could do this, and I think you could do that, and particularly around organizing and providing administrative leadership on programs. And one of the things that we were actually talking about a little bit earlier was that a lot of physicians are not really good at organizing things. So once they figured out I could do that, I was pretty set. From there, I went on 25 years ago now to work as the director of the ARP Foundation. So obviously working again in aging, and subsequently was the CEO of the Consultant Pharmacists National Organization. So pharmacists who specialize in geriatric patients who have complex medical needs. And then I've now come back into the philanthropy world as head of the organization in ChangeMakers and Aging that works on all of the, bringing together all of the foundations and corporate charities that work on aging issues.
And obviously, we're all aging. This is becoming something as, when you talk about the fried chicken, as we all eat a little healthier, and medicine improves and all of these different things, we're living a lot longer now than years past. And when you look at what that means, a growing population, we're all getting older, and now there's more infrastructure needs. There's a lot of issues that you guys are definitely working in the trenches on. Share a little bit about just what you do overall. I mean, you kind of talked about the number of organizations, but dive in a little bit deeper to what you guys do.
So we're a national organization of primarily foundations, but private foundations and public charities and others like the United Ways and so forth, as well as a growing number of corporate charitable organizations, all of which have some interest in aging. So we do education work, we do networking, we do meetings like our national meeting that we're having here in Memphis coming up. But in some ways, what we try to do more than anything is serve our local and regional foundation members, which is the majority of our membership. So a local foundation will usually have lots of different areas of charitable giving, which may be very different from each other. So they may work in health and human services, but they also may work in, developing parks, may work in recreational things. And they're not going to have staff who are experts in everything. So what we do a lot of is programs that try to help our local foundations learn about how programs have been working in other places, to give them different ideas, and to bring them together so they can have good conversations with each other about how things should work.
And on your end, obviously, you have a national perspective, so you get to learn from other cities and organizations and benchmark and share those resources and learnings across the board.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of what we do. A great deal of our work is around highlighting programs that have been successful, including, but also some that have not been.
Sure.
And trying to help people learn from each other in that process, but also to help the charitable world understand better what the life of those who are providing the service is like, because it's a very challenging time in the human service world in general, and certainly the aging program specifically. And we want to help our members to understand that when they're kind of besieged by requests for funding, which happens to many of them, what that's like and how they can help sort through the programs that are more likely to be successful and help them provide better service for them.
What would you say are the top, maybe we'll say 2 or 3 biggest issues that you see right now when it comes to aging and the work that you guys are doing? I mean, obviously health. I mean, there's so much, even on a local level, on access, quality of life matters, even little things like being able to get out and enjoy concerts and stay engaged with the arts. I mean, there's a lot of different nuances, but what are some of the big ones that stand out to you as some of the most important pieces of the puzzle?
One of them is, and this is a pervasive across the whole field, is that aging is really difficult for Americans to deal with. And we've always known that, but we have been involved with a number of major national organizations, including AARP, to do a very large set of studies and then communication planning around this. Aging is a hard sell. Americans don't like to think of themselves as aging. They don't want to be aged. And you see this pervasively in our culture. So that's a very hard thing to crack through. Very often what we do, and many folks who work with us do, is to talk about other aspects of what the philanthropy groups do. So for example, we talk about transportation. Of course, we're involved in, and we're primarily interested in how that impacts older people.
Sure.
But it doesn't make sense for us to come in and say, you know what, you need to start an aging transportation program. What's better is to start saying things like, you run in transportation programs, how many people over 60 are part of that program? And sort of how could you extend that if you focused more attention on what the special needs of those older people would be? But you also see it on the flip side of this, which is we tend to think of all of these issues as older people as being dependent, as being frail, as being needy, when in fact that's not even not only the majority of older people, but it's not even probably more than 10% who have really strong needs health-wise and otherwise. So what we don't want to focus on is entirely on what people see as all the negative things. You don't want to spend your time just in happy talk about it. But on the other hand, we have found that there are ways and programs that are able to incorporate older people into the wider community and work on issues that will help everyone in the community.
Well, I can even think locally, you've got organizations like Porter Leith where they have seniors and different adults that will come in and volunteer with the kids and read to them. So they really leverage their availability time-wise to be able to step in and be a huge catalyst in the lives of all these youth, whether it be reading or just spending time with them or acting out in plays. I mean, just really neat ways to leverage those relationships. And on both sides, the kids gain tremendously from it, but the adults do as well. And so it's using it, to your point, is not of it's how can we leverage what they're good at and maybe the freedom that they might have a little bit more than someone over here that's trying to work 8:30 to 5:30 and carve out time there. But now it's a win for everybody in the community.
Well, there's no question that older people are the drivers of every volunteer program in every community in the United States. And that's true also of the people that are usually the most charitable and certainly that lead charitable organizations, the boards of every arts group in town. Those are really important resources that we tend to ignore because these are not the folks who need help. But they are all part of the community. And I think that raises the important thing that we are all in this together. We don't live in age-segregated communities, and we don't live in age-segregated families. So we talk about aging as, and certainly that's what my career has been around, is trying to make sure that the needs of older people are incorporated in the larger community, not simply that we're going to do a bunch of things for older people, but nobody else.
Share with us on your end, when you look at what makes a healthy community, one that's truly inclusive and together, and as you said, we're all in this together. So what are some of the things that you look at as a healthy community, especially for those, when you talk about being there for those who are aging and kind of building that sort of society, what are the things that you're looking at?
The biggest success that we've had in all of this over the last 15 years or so has been the development of what's called age-friendly communities or livable communities. And the notion of that is exactly what I said, that it's not creating better communities for older people. It's creating better communities for everyone by paying attention to the needs of older people and other specialized groups. So it's everything from infrastructure to services. But for taking a concrete, literally example, take sidewalks. So sidewalks are important for safety, for transportation, for exercise. And it's one of those things that's useful for small children. It's for families, for everyone. If they're not age exclusive. But very often, if older people no longer have the ability to drive, then in many communities that we've built over the last 30 or 40 years have been created not only without sidewalks, but so very often they're cul-de-sac communities and so forth. If you lose the ability to drive, you become a prisoner in your own community. So what we want to do is think through how you can continue to build communities that are good places, as we say, good places to grow up and to grow old. And there's a lot of examples now across the United States and really around the world about how you would actually go about doing this.
Well, I'm even thinking as you're talking, there's an organization, ITN Memphis, that through volunteers will allow, when you talk about transportation, it's volunteers that basically will pick seniors up and take them to get medicine, go run errands, do all sorts of things, and then those volunteers basically get credits that they can use for their family members or for themselves later on. And so it's kind of a neat way to leverage where you see a need, but identify it and try to serve that gap.
Right.
What are some things, that when you look around the nation, what are maybe one or two programs that you say, okay, these are neat programs that they're working in those cities, and these are things we want to highlight for other cities that should be paying attention?
Well, I think certainly this whole arena of integrating services is very important. Places like Kansas City, for example, have done really a marvelous job over a number of years in trying to pull together what are fairly modest increments of service, but trying to think through how could we integrate these things better. And you see this particularly in the infrastructure issues, but also in transportation and housing. So if you're thinking about how are you going to better institute a transportation system, if you don't think explicitly about the needs of young children and also about the needs of older people, you're not going to include them in the plan. You only revise the plan every 10 or 20 years, and major infrastructure projects take 30 years. So if you're not going to start by thinking about those issues, you're not going to be able to manage them. And that's a place that's done a tremendous amount of work. But we have a really great example in that the Americans with Disabilities Act passed 25 years ago. And one of the parts that people forget was part of that act was curb cuts. So this is a really humble thing. And of course, curb cuts were designed basically for people with wheelchairs. Well, stand on any corner in a busy city, and the people that use curb cuts are not people in wheelchairs. They're people pulling luggage or strollers or, whatever. And it's a reminder that those kind of things are incredibly important in terms of not only how we're changing the community for today, but in generations to come. And if it's always striking to me when I go to Europe, for example, that you come to a lot of historic buildings and there is no accessible access at all, and nor do they really see the point of that. And here in the United States, after 25 years, we now are used to it and expect that when you come to a building, there'll be some way for people with mobility issues to get in the building. That's a tremendous thing and a real good example of how you can think about these issues that are good for everyone, but also end up being very good for older people.
And making it a legislative part as well, saying that this is important for us as not just a local community, but a national community, and these are the things that we're going to help. Right. Switch gears a little bit and talk about the difference between urban and suburban. When you talk about rural and how those needs are played out with an aging community, what are the differences? What are the nuances? What are the things that you think are really important for rural communities to be focused on versus the urban?
That's an area that we've been devoting a lot of time and attention to over the last few years, partly because it's a very underserved set of issues. There's not a whole lot that is out there around rural aging, and most of it is really depressing. So you can read a lot of articles that have basically long lists of all the things that you can't do in rural areas, and yet 20% of the U.S. population lives in rural areas. 95% of the United States is a rural area in terms of the geography of the United States. And so these are people that want to stay in their community, they want to thrive in their community, and how can we assist in that in a better way? In about 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a national summit on improving rural transportation using new technologies like driverless cars, Uber and Lyft, various kinds of artificial intelligence systems that are able to reroute buses, for example, based on a whole bunch of criteria. And, things that are starting to be used and now are starting to be common in urban areas, but have not made it to the rural areas at all. So there's a lot of work to do in lots of different arenas, because these are people that want to stay there, and we're starting to know more about what are the triggers that cause them to have to leave, certainly frailty and those issues, but housing issues, which has been a major focus of the Plow Foundation here in Memphis, and being able to think through what people need in those communities is a particularly important but a very complicated effort.
Well, when you think rural, transportation, especially for those that live out maybe in farmland or further out, and so access to then medicine to be able to get to the doctor, physician, specialist, but even things like food deserts. I mean, you take for granted, like, they might be in a rural area where there might be farmland, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have access to fresh food. And so being able to, I know like MIFA here with their Meals on Wheels, having a delivery system, and in many cases you might be driving many miles to reach one person, but that's obviously going to be mission critical, is getting them the food and also the connection point to check in on a regular basis.
Right. And groups like Meals on Wheels do just a phenomenal job at those two pieces. So it's not simply the food itself, but also just as a not only breaking isolation, but also a point of contact. But it was interesting. I was up in the Adirondacks region of New York speaking at a conference a few weeks ago, and one of the things that they said was really striking, because it's a beautiful area, mountainous region, gets a lot of snow in the winter, and is very cold. And so people were talking about the need to be able to get transportation to grocery stores and so forth. And some gentleman stood up in the audience and said, I can go on my Amazon account and get 50 rolls of toilet paper delivered to me by the end of the day. Why is this so hard? And that's
a good point.
That's a really good point.
Right.
It's like, so there are commercial services, and of course they charge for their service.
Right.
But and then people started discussing. Well, so we may be in a situation pretty soon where, because of Amazon and the rest, there's no particular reason for an older person to leave their home in the winter. And that is not a good thing either, because the grocery store and places like that become really areas of socialization in small communities.
Well, I'm thinking creative aging here, where they take arts programs, music, and they engage, and they go to rec centers and senior centers and everything, and they try to really go where people are. But that's the idea, is to gather them together, put together curriculum that's going to engage them, to keep their brain stimulated and keep them engaged, but also the socialization aspect. I mean, just to be there together and share, and that's just as important as the physical activity of it.
Right. And I will point out that use the word them to describe those who are aging. Yeah. Even though you and I are both aging.
I'm getting in that category. Yes. They, we, us, yes. All of us.
Well, but the thing is, it is an important thing, because we tend, what we know as Americans, tend to think of older people as them.
Right.
And if you ask an 80-year-old who's aging, they'll say 90-year-olds. If you ask a 50-year-old, it's 60 years old.
Sure.
And so it's important to be able to make sure that we think of these always as things that we're doing together in the entire community. And that's one of the things that's really striking about rural communities, is just on a practical basis, there's no way that you're ever going to have enough money to create separate sets of services for older and younger people. So you're going to have to think about, if you're going to build a recreation center, or a school or something else, why aren't you also thinking about combining that with a senior center, with a community gym, with all these kind of things? So all these things can draw people together in a natural kind of way.
So to your point, instead of having a program that truly focuses on this aspect, really encompass everyone and bring them together and galvanize. So instead of being a program for senior citizens, creative art, it should be for everybody. Right. So bring them all together.
And that's hard to do, and it's hard to sustain. But nevertheless, that should always be the goal.
Sure.
And you see it more often in these rural areas where there's kind of those dividing walls that don't seem to be as strong. But in the community where I live in Arlington, which of course is not a rural area, they did exactly this. They needed to build another elementary school. County land is very precious in an environment like that. So what they ended up doing is building an elementary school. There's also a senior center. There's a gym. So basically from like 6 a.m. till midnight every day, there's always people in the building.
Nice.
So it's always, and it's tricky to think through that, and that's not the way people think, and there was a lot of resistance to it and all that stuff. But it works wonderfully. And it's then becomes the location where everybody in the community comes for other kinds of events. It's where the county fair is, it's
right.
So that kind of thing where you really are able to draw people together, because social isolation is an enormous issue for many Americans, but for older people particularly. And we know that it has severe health impacts, and for people living in rural areas, that's always a particularly important thing, especially as often happens, their children and so forth have left the community. So they don't have anyone to naturally interact with in the way that they used to.
Sure. I mean, already I'm learning a lot, obviously, so that's part of the fun of these is I learn just as much as everybody else. When you look at how we can all play a part, I mean, obviously just that in and of itself, converting it to they versus we, that in and of itself is maybe step one. But how do we help? How do we get involved? I mean, obviously, to your point, looking at it from a lens of we're all in this together, and so what's good for one is good for another, and how can we bring these communities together, like a school and a senior center, so that everybody's kind of playing together in the same sandbox, so to speak, and you're leveraging your resources in a bigger way, in a more efficient way. What are some ways, though, that we can help? I mean, from volunteerism to activation to, how do we help?
Well, I think part of it is just that changing that mindset to saying that we are all in this together, and mean it in not just a superficial sort of way, as we sometimes do, but that it really is important that we pay attention to all generations and their needs in this case. And that means that older people who sometimes think, well, I don't have kids in school anymore, so why do I have to pay all these taxes for the, there's lots of reasons for that. But all these things have to fit together, and we all have to agree that that's what we're going to do as a community. We're in a very complicated and difficult and divisive time politically. But the thing is, even in those divided times, and of course I live and work in Washington,
right.
That it is still quite possible, and every day people get up and go do these things where what they're doing is trying to draw these threads together. And it's not impossible to do. There are people of goodwill throughout the community and throughout the nation who are trying to do this. But it's really paying attention to what those specific needs might be. So aging is a very broad set of people. It's going to be 25% of the U.S. population in the next few years. Incredibly diverse group of people. And and the baby boomers, my generation, that were born after the Second World War, it's the most diverse generation in every capacity, not only racially and ethnically, languages spoken, those kind of things, but also issues like wealth. So half of Americans are going to go into retirement with less than $50,000 in savings of any sort for the rest of their life. And that means that the rule that's been in effect for a long time, the 50-50 rule, that more than half of Americans will depend on Social Security alone for more than half of their income, is going to continue, and it's actually going to grow. On the flip side, there are people that are going to have more money than folks like us have ever had. And so there's this growing wealth disparity in the aging community. So a one-size-fits-all is not going to work, but the question is, how do we figure out how to put the pieces together in a way that make it a better place for all of us?
Give us maybe one or two, when you look at cities that are getting it right and at the local level, and some of the ways that they're leveraging their citizens and making a difference, and it can be specific programs. I mean, I'll kind of leave it up to you, but give us maybe two ways that we can leverage locally and make a difference and get involved.
Well, sure. Certainly the work that's been done here in conjunction with Habitat for Humanity, which I'm not sure people understand how dramatic their change has been. So Habitat's model is that they build homes from scratch. It's usually a younger family who falls under in the poverty level, has to be able to work on the house and provide sweat equity, as well as find a mortgage. So that's their model. And now what they're finding is, and the work here done in Memphis with the Plow Foundation support, is that already a third of the work that they do nationally does not fall into that model. It is helping older people repair their home so that they can remain in their home. That's a very different set of issues, and it's a very expensive thing. But the thing is, otherwise you see, as you see very often, older people living in places that are unsafe, they're inappropriate. Maybe the solution really is not to live there anymore, but then they have to live somewhere else, and so where's that going to be? So that's a wonderful example, I think. It is now being seen really as a national model around the country. Another very specific example is a program we worked with in Miami in the Little Havana section, the traditional Cuban neighborhood, where they had a park in the central part of the neighborhood. And when we started doing age-friendly stuff, we were talking about recreational facilities and that kind of stuff. And they said, well, one of the issues is the county runs programs for children in the park. And if you go to any park anywhere in the United States, there's two groups that use the park during the week: small children and older people. And there are all these programs for kids, and there's absolutely nothing for older people. And so that started the discussion going with the county, and of course the last thing that county folks want to hear is like, here's another program coming at us for more money. But said, think about ways you can combine these things. Once again, so they were getting ready to build a kids playground, like build some exercise equipment for older people right there, and because older people would come and exercise in the park. Then it came to a further discussion about, so why does the county have employees that work on children's programs and no one's paying attention to this other group? So the county's now added employees to this, and they're now designing programs like this throughout the county. And that then led to a discussion about, well, we still see that some older people don't come here during the day. And they said, well, let's ask the older people around the park why they're not coming. And it turns out that, sidewalks are broken. There are people hanging around that they feel uncomfortable around. And so that led to an effort to try to build up the sidewalks and other infrastructure stuff, but also then, increasing the police presence in the park. So that's a wonderful example of how you can start very, very, very small and sort of naturally grow out to something that now everybody comes to the park and
Right.
likes it better, and it's not just for older people or for children.
Well, and the intentionality of it. I mean, that
Yeah.
everything you're talking about is being very intentional with your approach. So let's go ahead and switch over. We call it a lightning round. These are just kind of quick questions and quick fun answers on your
Okay.
end. There's no script. It just bounces all over the place for whatever comes into my head. But
Okay.
give us a recent book that you've read.
So I just read a biography of the Roman writer Cicero, which was a fascinating guy, a lawyer. His famous quote is, "If your client is innocent, attack the lawyer, attack the client, attack the other person that's in the lawsuit. If the person's guilty, attack their lawyer."
Does any of that apply to the work that you do?
No, but that's the great